introduction. Thank you everyone for coming. It's a pleasure to be giving the very first colloquium of the season here at the department. And what I'm going to present is the work I've been doing with my PhD student, Kamesh Kurangi, co-supervised with Christoph Muse. Kamesh is one of the PhD students I left in the UK. And so he's at the University of Southampton, but in spirit, he's a member of the Banking Analytics Lab and one very active, as my PhD students can attest. So what we've been trying to do is we've been trying to understand whether our statistical techniques work better than traditional reduced form and stochastic models for mid-cap. So there is a reason why in large cap, why in the big companies that trade in the stock market, everyone uses stochastic processes to understand their risk. The underlying reason is that there are deep markets and profound signals in the market that can give you an idea or a very good idea of what risk that particular company, that many times is a micro country, sometimes it's even larger than a country. I mean, Apple's yearly turnover beats a lot of countries in the world. And for them, using the market signals is a wise idea. However, a mid-cap company, and I'm going to explain immediately what they are. Sorry. It's not going to happen. There we are. There we are. So mid-caps, which are companies that are between 1 billion and 10 billion with a B in market capitalization, are neither here nor there. So we know that for retail, alone for you and I, we need to use statistical models, credit scores, and the like. For small companies and micro companies, also credit scores are the traditional choice. But for companies that are growing, that are selling bonds in the market, but at the same time, they are not very liquid and they don't work in markets that are as deep as the large cap markets, maybe there is an avenue for us to use our statistical techniques, in particular deep learning, for reasons I will explain during the talk, to actually get them to create some better default prediction than the ones that you will get from traditional statistical models and from traditional stochastic models. So my agenda today is explain a little bit more what mid-caps are and where are they placed here, the problem, what are we basing our research on, what do we think our contributions are, a little bit about the data, and how did we do. Spoiler alert, this works, right? And finally, some conclusions on where do we see this moving forward and what are we actually trying to do now with other members of the Banking Analytics Lab. So, okay, what's a mid-cap? As I explained, mid-cap is a publicly traded company, so you can buy stocks of them with less than 10 billion in market capitalization and with more than 1 billion, right? Anything below 1 billion is called a small cap. Between 1 to 10 is a mid-cap. The thing is, these are usually non-investment grade rated. So that means that they will not normally be in portfolios of what banks will use to create their investments, right? They are a lot riskier. They are a lot less liquid. So sometimes we could see mid-caps that sold a bond and then weeks could go by and we see no transactions whatsoever on those instruments. Sometimes even their stocks are illiquid. And their information is all over the place. It's in several databases with different levels of reporting. They still report their fundamentals quarterly. This is still a stock that's traded with everything that entails. But they are not the companies that you will think about right away. However, these are also not unknown companies, right? So Virgin Galactic is a mid-cap. in the 90s, Apple was a mid-cap, and people kind of knew those companies. Right. So what's the challenge here? As I've explained so far, the credit spreads and the prices implied by these models tend to underestimate what's empirically observed. So this is something that it's called the credit puzzle, and there are several papers that say that it exists, it doesn't exist, it's a consequence of market depth. There are a whole bunch of different assumptions of why this happened. But most models, most traditional stochastic models, what they do is they underestimate what is usually observed. And this is far more pronounced in mid-cap. So this tends to result in higher losses than other types of instruments. And as it usually happens in a publicly traded company, credit risk is not easy to split from market risk, right? So it's all a whole bunch of things playing together, right? Also, this leads to many different data sources being relevant to estimate a mid-cap credit risk. So you have the fundamentals, where the company is today. You have the market signals, what people are doing with the stock, and you have the macroeconomic conditions that the company is subject to. So all of that plays together to lead towards a proper credit measurement here, right? So from the point of view of modeling, that's really fun because we need to have the ability to mix all of that in different models. And people have been very creative in how they actually do it, right? There is also the thing that we need a term structure here. So when you invest in mid-caps, you don't care only with the one-year default, as it usually happens in credit scoring, right? Something to give a loan for you and me. Here you need to know the risk at 3 months, 6 months, 1 month, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and the whole term structure of the default curve for that particular company. So it's a fairly fun problem. Lots of data on the one side, term structures on the other side, and known difficulties in commonly used models today. So as I mentioned, there are 3 types of models here: statistical models, structural models, and reduced form models. Several people have been publishing papers in the last 2 or 3 years saying that machine learning has a potential here. Remember, that's kind of what I do, right? And now from our other analysis, we have been using deep learning models to combine complex sources of data into unique models in a seamless way. So we know that we can just take these deep learning models, treat the data in a way that is palatable to these models, and the models will be able to create these very complex structures, combined structures that take into account all models at the same time. So our proposal is to adapt transformer models, which are state-of-the-art in natural language processing. And you will say, why natural language processing? Because natural language is a sequence of events. When I'm talking to you right now, I am putting one word after the next, right? One concept after the next. And that is giving you a meaning, right? So transformers, which are sequence-to-sequence models, so you take a sequence and use, they are commonly used for translation, for example. Take a sequence, you get a sequence. Could also be used in a way in which I'm going to explain, in order to understand this complex time series in an intelligent way. So we will use it to understand our panel data, our time series of prices, of fundamentals, and of macroeconomic factors. So what do we think our general aim and paper contributions? And please, I'm happy to hear any comments you may have. The only thing that we have so far is a preprint. This is under review since 2 days ago. We literally submit this on November 15th, so it's fresh off the press. what we want to do here is to develop a novel approach to credit risk modeling using deep learning for mid-caps, of course. And we were going to propose a way to use these sequence-to-sequence models for this purpose. And we are also going to construct this framework to mixing all of this complex data in an intelligent way. And also design a mathematical structure within the models to also give you these curves I give you, right? I told you about these term structures, giving you default rates at 3, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years in one model. So a little bit about deep learning here. We know that machine learning models have been shown to improve performance, right? In default prediction, it's full of papers all over the place showing this. And also, when you have sequence-to-sequence models, transformer models have been state-of-the-art in several other fields. We ourselves, this is actually us, used it recently this year to estimate default in micro businesses. Now I'm going all the way to the other corporate field to estimate credit risk for micro businesses. And in that field, they use text directly, so written evaluations in order to predict default. So, as I said, we're going to take those models that are commonly in text, and we're going to adapt them in order to create a model that can mix all the data. But also, we're going to study the interpretability that we can get out of this, because these are black box models. From the start, they have been designed to be very complex models. But recently, there have been some advances that allow us to visualize, right, and to try to create, to impose some game theoretical models, traditional Shapley values that are quite common in finance, in order to understand how these inputs are talk to each other and generate this complex risk profile. So I'm going to show you how to create the models. I'm going to show you what are the inputs, how to create the outputs, how to design the losses. And finally, I'm going to show you how we can actually create some interpretations out of these values. That's kind of the goal of the talk. And I want to check the time. It's 4:15. So I'm doing pretty well with time. Okay, right. In order to make it interpretable, what we were going to use is something called attention heat map visualizations and Shapley values. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the data. As I said, the whole point about this thing is that the data is fairly complex. So in order to study this problem, we have 3 sources of data: fundamentals, pricing, and market data. So the fundamentals is accounting data that's released quarterly by the company, right? If they trade in the stock market, they need to release their fundamentals. The only constraint we have here is that we are considering the period when the company was a mid-cap. So, for example, once you stop being a mid-cap, we do not look you anymore. And when you were a small cap, we also don't study the period. So here, the whole point is that we're going to have different lengths, right? We're going to study maximum 3 years back. So maximum a total of 3 times 4, 12 quarters. But that we may not have all the quarters available for you if you were a small cap at one point in time, right? So the sequences are of different length. Same thing with the prices. We're going to get daily price data for the stocks and the bonds that the company has been selling, if any. Many of these companies have 10 bonds in the market. Many of these companies have no bonds in the market. So whatever we have, we plug it in. And finally, we're going to have market data, macro data, seeing what's going on with the indexes that are relevant to this. So we're going to take industrial indexes, we're going to take overall macro indexes, we're going to take everything that we can get our hands on that reflects how the overall stock market is doing up until that time, right? That's going to be our input. And to build default is not as simple as stop paying in mid-cap companies. Default is either stop paying a bond, which is the obvious one, But you can also subject yourself to Chapter 11, which will be a form of default. You could liquidate the company, which happens in this regard, and or there could be a CDS, credit default swap, that has been called because of any of the conditions in the contract. We consider any of those 4 events a default. What we are not considering in this is mergers and acquisitions. You could say, well, the company could be doing poorly, so it was cheap and that way it was acquired. Yes, but it never defaulted. And this is not a merchant acquisition predictor. This is a default predictor, right? So we mix all of that. What we end up is a relatively large data set of around 1 million events, with around 2,000 companies that defaulted in that way, right? We only had around 23,000 companies in total, right? Anyone that qualify under this 1 billion market, right? This was for the North American market. Right, we split them into defaulters and non-defaulters, of course, right? And to validate this, one important thing is that it is very easy to cheat in machine learning with this. So how could I have cheated? And I bet you that I could have published this at a decent journal by cheating. You could have said, well, I'm going to take the whole history of the company. I'm going to take the first half year, and I'm going to leave in the test set the last part, right? That will be cheating because you will have the same behavior of the company and you will probably see the degradation, right? I also wanted to see how well this is to generalize. Well, we wanted to see how well this is to generalize over unseen companies, right? So to get correct market structures out of this. So the way we do it is we are going to design test sets in which we leave complete companies out, and we're going to also do time splits. So we're going to validate across the 2 dimensions, company dimensions and time dimensions, right? The idea is that we can try to see if the model is actually capturing patterns that are replicable across other companies. Right, so we split into traditional training, validation, and test set, right? So we have the test set with these characteristics I mentioned, right? 3,000 firms, 10,000 firms for training, 3,000 firms for validation. If you don't work in machine learning, you may not know what a validation sample is. It's part of the training set, and it helps you with stopping training when you start learning non-generalizable patterns. That's it. Nothing too complex to worry about. Right. So, oh yeah, I didn't mention the other important thing. We captured 30 years of data. So Kamesh did a great work there of collecting things from many different data sets. So we use CompuStat, we use DataStream, we use Bloomberg, the whole thing. So it took a while to collect the data, but we felt that that was precisely where the gains could come from. Now, what are we benchmarking ourselves against? Since we need something that had the same structure to predict default, we are not creating calibrated PDs that were used for banks. So we are comparing ourselves against other statistical models that are in use in this area. So taking a look at the latest papers in the area, there is a whole bunch of machine learning models that use XGBoosting, and the other models use time series models based on some sort of logistic regression. So we build those as a benchmark for our architectures. And of course, within our field, we also wanted to test against other simpler deep learning models. So we took traditional, if you're doing time series and you Google time series deep learning, you're going to end with this model here, LSTMs. So we're using that one. But there is also a very powerful model that's newer, that's less complex but more powerful, called temporal convolutional networks, that has given very good results. So we're also using those as a benchmark. There was no paper implementing this, but given that we had already been working on transformers and this one was quite powerful, we decided to put it in and see how we did against our models. So this one, even though it's not the focus of the paper, it will still be a contribution because no one had used it before for this purpose. Right, so this is how it looks like. two things here. To the left of your screen, you're going to see what a temporal convolutional network is. So deep learning using convolutional neural networks is the typical thing that's used for computer vision. So what it does is it takes an image and it looks for maps, which are basically things that happen there, right? Or things that appear, and then combines them in every layer to create these complex structures. So this first thing is going to learn like a general pattern. Within the same signal, this one is going to learn combinations of those. This one is going to learn combinations of those combinations, and so on and so forth as we stack layers. What we are doing in a temporal convolutional network is we are creating the connections. So the first layer will still take a look at different parts of the sequence. This is a sequence. So think of the input here as a time series, right? This is going to be split. The temporal convolutional network, what it will do is will take this, identify the most important maps, and then pass it in a sort of temporal way, right? In this diagonal way to learn patterns from one side, and as you can see here, to the other side too. So it's a way of directing the flow of data to not learn these things just stacking the layers, but stacking them in kind of a diagonal way to learn sequence to sequence, which is the objective here. Okay, so that's our benchmark though, right? This is temporal convolutional network. We didn't do much here. We just applied this structure for the problem. The fun part for us is this model right here. This is our proposal. And I'm going to stop a little bit here. So the inputs is, as I explained, the fundamental channel, the market channel, and the pricing channel. This is just for one company, and we take a look at the last 3 years of data. Same thing here, right? And the last few prices, right, for a year back. So we have different lengths. It is not necessary to have all of this data. If some data is missing, you simply pad them, put some zeros in them. So you can put all of that. You just need to get this table, right? No need to have all data, can be full of null values, can be illiquid, because we know that the market is illiquid here. We wanted our model to be robust against lack of data. So here we are. What happens then? Now this goes to a first model that what it does is it creates features for every one of the channels, right? And here, every model, every one of these will create a few combinations of data, right, of the inputs to create a set of variables that then are given to the final model, which is the transformer that we discuss. We concatenate those results. Then we use max pooling to get rid of the signals that are not very strong. And then finally, we create a traditional neural network, dense layer, right? And then finally, we do a softmax, because remember, we have 3 years. No, this is not a softmax, sorry, 3 logistic functions. So we're going to get one probability for 3 years, one probability for 2 years, one probability for 1 year, one probability for 6 months, one probability for 3 months. So this is a fairly complex data flow. In order to make this happen, this is a fairly big model. I think we ended up with a 50 million parameters or so. In order to make this happen, we needed to program our own custom loss. The custom loss is an entropy function that is not a softmax, because probabilities need not add up to 1. So we designed a loss that what it did was it allowed the model to learn this curve, right, of default to the future. We did not need to add any constraints to this. One of our worries was that we were not able to get a term structure that was increasing. Of course, if you're predicting default, the 3-year default, the 2-year default, the 1-year default, and so on and so forth, those do need to follow some sort of rank. It was not necessary to impose that in this function, so we got lucky there. I am still not 100% sure why. but it wasn't necessary. And finally, to measure the output, we needed to see how this performed across the whole time. So we basically use a combined AUC metric, nothing too fancy there. And that's that. So this model is quite big, and I want to enter a little bit more into detail in what composes each one of these. So this is the attention encoder. Now, what's an attention model? An attention model, which is the transformer I've been speaking about, is a model that mimics, again, vision, but it has been mostly used for sequences exclusively. And it comes from the fact that when you look at something, so if I'm telling you, take a look at this, right now you're putting attention on this, or maybe you're doing something else, nothing to do with the talk, doesn't matter, but whatever it is you have your attention at, everything else looks blurry, and you're not paying too much attention on that. There are many studies about people that when you tell them pay attention to this, you can make someone walk in a gorilla suit behind them and they are going to completely ignore it. So that model of trying to understand where in a sequence, so now let's go back to time series. If you know that when there are 3 peaks in that order, in that time frame, that's useful, you need to pay attention to the appearance of this sequence. An attention model, what it does is it tries to create exactly that. It tries to create something called an attention head, which will attempt to identify where in the signal there are things that we should focus our attention to. How do we do this? Well, the first thing that we need to do is we need to give it something called a positional encoding. So something that tells the model where you're at. And you can do this with a convolution of 1 dimension, right? You pass this will normalize the input. Then you give the positional encoding through this. An alternative here is to add one of those LSTM models I told you about. We also tried that. And then you do this multi-headed attention, which is simply an exponential function over the sum of other exponential functions trying to identify where what point here should have a higher value than the rest. So which one should be receiving attention, right? What we are using here is something called self-attention, because you can do something called cross-attention, so trying to see if these appear when contrasted to this other point. Here, what we want is to compare the whole time series against itself to try to see which points by themselves are the more relevant in a combined way. Finally, you add the outputs for every element and normalize it, and then you do a traditional neural network to try to get some activations out of it, and then you have an output. What this will do is this will encode in a fairly complex way the inputs that you're getting. So this is the way it works. You get your inputs that are going to come with your time series, right? Remember that we have several channels. They enter to your encoder preprocessing, and what you will get is a compressed mix of the most important things that were here. So this, for example, could be saying, take a look at this, and this in this time series. And since we're giving it many time series, it will also say, go look at the time series right next to it. So when these 3 points happen, and this point happen, and in your third time series, these other 3 things happen, then your risk goes up. So it's a fairly complex construct in terms of data flow. And that's what got my attention when I started thinking, redundancy aside, when I was studying these models, because what this can do is this can capture in a fairly complex manner. This can capture the occurrence of events, right? By taking a look at all of your inputs at the same time. And that's really difficult to do when you're doing any of the other models that we commonly use. So that's that. Okay, right. Let me check time again. Okay, 34. Perfect. So what happened? Well, I'm showing you this, right? So of course we got the best model. Let me tell you what happened here. So first, I'm going to discuss the models, just taking a look at data one by one. Okay, just to see without giving the whole thing. So our model, we call it the transencoder model, just in the fundamentals, was able to predict better than any other models. However, using only market data, the LSTM was the strongest model, and the traditional neural network, this was not surprising to me. I think that since these were created for noisy time series, and this is an only one noisy time series, I was expecting this to perform a little bit better. But when you put the dirtier pricing data, the transencoder also wins. But once we start training with the whole thing, now when we try our model against every other structure, then our model is by far the superior one. So apart, we're getting AUCs, combined AUCs of around 0.7. Combined, we were getting AUCs of around 0.82. And one more thing. When we train this model, when you train this model, let me go here. You have three sources of data, right? And you're trying to combine all of these into a unique model at the end. If you fire hose all the data at once into the model, and you try to optimize that, there are so many things happening that the model did not converge very well. In fact, we started losing again a traditional XGBoosting model that had been the state of the art in this space. Okay, what can you do to get around it? The combination of data occurs here in this part of the model. So what you could do is to freeze everything here, train this part first, unfreeze, train that part second, and finally unfreeze and train this part third. So you first train the single channel models up until they are sufficiently good, and then you release that to the final model, and now you let everything change. That strategy was discovered by Google a while ago, and it's called differential training. And only then, when we did that, we were able to beat other alternatives. The reason is the complexity of the search space. These models are complex. As I said, they have 500, 1 million parameters. Even for language modeling, the latest model has something like 1 trillion parameters, which honestly is absurd. But it has been created more than anything as a technical feat, more than certain usefulness. The difference between a 100 million parameter model and a 1 trillion parameter model was 0.1% extra result. So not really useful. But the important part there is that there is this complexity in how you actually feed the data to these models that is more akin to designing a circuit than to training a traditional statistical model in this space. I felt a lot closer when we were having these discussions of how you start talking about a processor, right? Like a computer processor, rather than actually designing something like an equation, like carefully controlled and stuff like that. That does not mean that you don't need to carefully control the data. You do, right? And that's the part where the interesting insights can come in saying like, okay, this is actually giving you something that is relevant, significant for your problem. Okay. So differential training. Okay, great. So now we have a cool model. The model works better than everything else out there. What now? Well, what we can try to do is we can try to understand whether there is a difference in training, right? Remember I told you interpreting these models was a key output of us. These models are fairly complex, so the interpretations are more holistic in nature. So what you do is you go look at the attention heads. Remember, each one is trying to focus on multiple activations. And we can try to see, given the inputs, normalize 12 periods back, you can try to understand what activates different things. And what you get is that here, everything here is non-defaulters, everything here is defaulters. A quick look at this shows you that defaulters require complex activations. These heads are the same head, but just by feeding them defaulters and just by feeding them non-defaulters, and then we average the outputs, the activations. Yellow means more activated, blue means no activation. What we are getting here is that defaulter firms require activations across the full search space, instead of requiring just some activations like this. You see, take a look at the non-defaulters. You were only worried about what had happened in the last few quarters. For the same head, so same variables, same focus, you need to activate a whole lot more in order to predict a default. Same thing is happening in the other heads. Our conclusion from this is that default is a fairly complex phenomenon. You say, duh, we knew that. Yes, but we can model it now. And I can use that in order to predict. We couldn't before. Or with a lot of effort, maybe you could identify some situations that were going on. I think that with these models, you're able to fit the data that you carefully controlled, cleaned, etc. And then you get results that are quite more sophisticated than traditional approaches. Okay, the second question that we had was, what was more important? Because we're using pricing, market data, and fundamental data. And this was an interesting validation to make, right? Is that what's the signal? Who gives the strongest signals regarding default? And our conclusion was, and when I read this, I actually cite a sigh of relief, because anything else would have been surprising to me, the fundamentals. That is, reminder, a fundamental within this context are the books of the company, what they tell the market, how they are operating, their income, their profits, their revenues. That's the most important thing. So the operation of the company is the most important thing. And then comes the market, the macroeconomy. And this was also something relevant to us, because there is a lot of studies that say that mid-cap companies are a lot more vulnerable to market conditions than large-cap companies. So you will expect the market to be relevant. And the less important, but not non-important, was the pricing. The pricing was the prices that you observed in the stock trading. And this leads us to another interesting conclusion. The pricing information is the main input for traditional structural models in mid-caps that, remember, I told you weren't very good, right? You tend to underestimate risk. Traditional financial knowledge will tell you that the price should already capture the fundamentals. But there is a lot of noise. There is a lot of trading going on here. And that can bring a lot of noise to this analysis. So those models sometimes are missing the mark in some. And in fact, in ours, weren't the most important given the strength of the other two signals. Another interesting conclusion that we did, remember that I told you that we have a model for 3 months out, 6 months out, 9 months out, and so on and so forth. So we're projecting default 3 months into the future, 6 months into the future, 9 months into the future, 1 year into the future, and so on and so forth. We wanted to see how the different elements in our data set change their behavior, change their importance with this. In the short term, pricing is a lot more important. Pricing is the yellow one right here. Green is the market, so the macroeconomic conditions, and blue is the fundamentals. But 3 years out, the fundamentals that the company is showing you today are the best predictor to see what will happen with the company tomorrow or 3 years into the future. That is, if you're built on solid foundations, the ups and downs of the economy will hit you less than if you are shaky, and the models are able to capture that quite well. So again, we got reasonable results. It's great when you get stuff like this, because this tells you that this helps you understand whether what you're doing actually has some grounding, right? Because if you got something completely different, then who knows why that could have happened. Okay, here, even though this will be common sense when you think about this, of course, right? The fundamentals of the company are the most important thing in the long term. Yes, but proving that numerically is not as easy. At least the model here gives you a very strong hint that that is exactly what's going on. So there we are. What time is it? Ah, perfect, 4:45. So this went spot on. The deep learning models can improve the predictive power as we expected, because they are able to combine all these complex data sources into this unique model. We can actually create a term structure with one model. That was something that was a traditional critique. Everyone said like, no, deep learning models simply needed, they give you this one shot, yes, no, classification, regression, but term structures are more difficult. Yeah. You just gotta play a little bit around with the loss function. Our loss function is not extremely sophisticated, but it does the job. There is certainly a way there to improve. There is a lot of people trying to build proper survival analysis models, right? Following Cox-like, regression-like likelihood functions and stuff like that. But that research is still ongoing. One thing is that these weren't as obscure as we thought it was going to be. We were able to get some fairly interesting conclusions to make it a little bit more transparent. Again, a lot more to do over there. There is probably a lot more that can be done in explainability and transparency in this space. So stay tuned. Transformers are great for sequence-to-sequence models. That's my other conclusion. And I've been working on this in different fields, and that has been consistently true. Consistently, transformers have been outperforming everything else in deep learning sphere. The original attention model, the original transformer model was called attention is all you need. That seems to be true even in other types of data that weren't the ones that it was originally planned for. Right, and the other fun thing, and something that really motivates me for my research, is that I'm always trying to study alternative data. So how to use complex data sources, combine social network data, time series data, video, audio. But and that's why my research is mostly focusing in deep learning, because you're able to do that. And thinking in let's digest data from multiple sources in a smart way is a different paradigm for this area, and so far so good, I think. We are thinking what we can do with this now. We're talking to some banks to see whether they want to run it parallel to their own models and see what happens. We'll see. We'll see. The important thing here is that at least the models are working. We have some strong evidence of what's going on, and I'm really excited to see what comes forward. So yeah, again, thank you very much for listening to me during these 45 minutes and staying there. I saw that it started with 25 people and I ended up with 26. I look like San Marino's invasion to Italy. Any questions, I'm happy to listen to you. Again, happy to hear any comments you may have. This is absolutely preliminary research. We just submitted the paper. Who knows what the reviewers will find. So thank you very much. And I'm going to stop recording so you can bombard me with questions. Cheers.